So then we would take a look at Sefiras haomer and take a look at it from the point of view of the halachos of counting, and the Ran, so the Rabbeinu Nisim on Psachim, really gives us, sort of opens up the whole sugya. So I thought that was a good place to start. And interestingly, the Ran is, and this is really because the Rif brings it down. So in the Dapei Rif, at the end of Psachim, literally the last page of in Psachim, the Dapei Rif, the Rif brings down these halachos around Sefiras haomer, even though the Gemaras themselves are menachos. So the Ran, who's one of the Rishonim, who's commenting on the Rif, is also right there on in Psachim. So he starts. So he's going off of the Rif versus the Rif quotes the Gemara, says v'cheichi de mitzvah lemnimni yomi hachanami mitzvah lemni shvui. So the Gemara says, just like it's a mitzvah to count the days, we also count the weeks. And the Ran says a mitzvah lemnimni shvi pluksahi b'menachos perak Rabbi Shmuel. So this is, again, he's quoting it back to where the source of it in the Gemara. And he says, Hasam Amar Abaye, mitzvah limni yomi, mitzvah limni shvui, Rabbanan debe Ravashi, manu yomi umani shvui. So Abaye says, and this is going according to the Rabbanan of Beirashi, debe Ravashi, that you count both days and weeks. Ameimar mani yumi v'lo mani shvui, but Ameimar didn't. He only counted days. Weeks he didn't count. Amar zecher lemikdash bi'almahu, and he said this is a zecher lemikdash, right? The fact that we count today is a zecher lemikdash. V'keven da'abai v'rabbanan devei Ravashi manu yomi v'manu shvui kaimalan kavasayu. And the Ran says that because we hold like Abai and the Rabbanan of devei Ravashi, so therefore we paskin that way, and we do count, right? We count days and weeks. Afagav da'ameimar poli galayhu v'perush hanochu b'mitzvah limni shvui hainu. B'tashim kol shavua v'shavua, but berova makomos echmiru atzim lamar b'chol yom hayom kach lekach laomer shem kach lekach shavuos v'yomim kach v'rov meforshim maskimim des versa omer achshav delik habav lo korban in elab ben rabban. So let me go back for a moment. So so he says that even when you're counting days and weeks, really what it should be is that you're counting the days, and every time you get to a complete week, then you would count the week, right? So if you get up to 7 days, you'd say, okay, this is 7 days, and it's 1 week. But once you're at, let's say, 8 days, you would just say today's 8 days, because it's not a complete week until you get to 2 weeks and then 3 weeks, etc. But he says that it's become the minhag in many places that we are machmer ourselves, and we do count the days. And once we hit a week, we start counting. It's 1 week plus 1 day, 1 week plus 2 days, etc. So we count that every day once we hit the first week. And then he says that that the majority of Meforshim hold that today Sefiras haomer is drabanan. Why? Because it says the leika haba v'lo korban. Korban in the element rabban, and because there is no korban haomer, which is when we started the counting from bringing of the omer on the second day of Pesach, but because we don't have that korban, and that was really the center of at least the starting of the omer of the sefira, therefore it is drabanan. And what is it? It's a zecher lemikdash kadamar meimar. Just like a meimar said, it's a zecher lemikdash. So hasam zecher lemikdash bi'almahu. Right. So and that meaning that language by a meimar means that it's really drabanan. It's not a deraisa. But then the Ran brings in an interesting thing, because for us, thinking that it's drabanan, what is the connection? What are we counting exactly? If it's really just about the omer offering. So the Ran says, as it goes further, he says, "Haggadah gam kin amru b'sha'ah she'amra," meaning that there's an agada, there's a medrash, there's an agada about this. It says, "Gam kin amru b'sha'ah she'amar lehem Moshe tavdun es lokim al hahar azeh." Right, when after Yetzias Mitzrayim, we're going through the Midbar, and Moshe Rabbeinu says we're going to go serve HaKadosh Baruch Hu on Har Sinai. So Amru Lo Yisrael. Moshe Rabbeinu, Emasai Avodah Zu. So Bnei Yisrael said, well, when are we going? Like, let's get there already. Amar Lehem. So Moshe said, responds, L'suv Chamishim Yom. It's not going to be for 50 days. V'hayu monim kol echad ve'echad la'atzmo. And therefore, each one of them was counting up to the day that they would go to Har Sinai. Mikan kavu chachamim l'sfiras haomer, and that's why chachamim were koveya to count the omer. Klomar bizman hazeh. What does that mean? That means that that's to say that today she'ein anu mevin korban v'lo omer. Right? Today we don't have the korban, we don't have the barley that we bring up. Ela mechshavina nun yom l'simchas haTorah. Rather, all we can sort of focus on or consider is the 50 days to the Simcha of Torah. Just like, and so we harken back to that time when Bnei Yisrael was also looking forward to Shavuos, to receiving the Torah.
But if you were told it's going to be 50 days, wouldn't you count backwards? You'd count down from 50.
Yeah,
right?
that's absolutely a great question. He doesn't deal with that, but maybe we'll try to get into that when we get into the more of the machshava. Right? Are we counting up? Is it an aliyah? Is it right? Definitely a good question. But he says vaday derech midrashu. Right? Clearly, the ikara de milsa zech lemikdash. Right? Clearly, this is an agada. Let's not lose sight of the fact that Sefiras haomer really is predicated on the korban itself. This is just an agadic version, but it also gives us an idea of how we continue to connect to the mitzvah as well. So it says that, yeah, it's the mitzvah zeichel lemikdash k'rabar meimar. So now he's going to go a little bit further and talk about. So now we're going to see more of the halachic aspects as well. And he says because it's Rabbanan, he says Tosfos says. The Kivin did midrabanan he tov lispor b'yom rishon b'savei chashecha kadei sheyu sheva shabbosos tamimos. Right? We had this idea of that there has to be 7 complete weeks, right? So because of that, we should be counting in a way that gives us 7 complete weeks, like entire days of counting. So he says kadei sheyu sheva shabbosos tamimos l'gamri. Right? So now we're going to so he says that the way that we should focus on it is that we should be counting at night, so that we have the complete days that we're counting. We're going to see he says something different by the Rambam, but we're going to see the Rambam inside. So I'm just going to skip over that. Let's see, where does that leave us? Okay, so I'm just going to skip down to V'chasav Mar Yehudaizal Demandalo Mani Omer Belela Kama. So now we're going to look at just a bit of a different aspect of it, which is what happens if you miss a day, right? So it says Mar Yehudai says Demandalo Mani Omer Belela Kama. What happens if you don't count the first night? Lo Mani Bishar Leilos. According to Mario Adai, you've lost it. It's if you lose the first night, you lose it. And he says that's because you require tamimos and you missed it, right? It's not complete if you miss that first night. But however, that's only the first night. But any subsequent night, if I miss counting at night, I can still count during the day, and that's still okay. Rav Hai Gaon says, cholik, he's a cholik on Mario Dai. He says, "Omer de'i mishum de'boy tmimus shachach be'echad hayamim nami chaser haminin ulefichachu omer she'im lo siper b'layla soper bayom." So Rav Hai says, what's the difference between the first night and all the subsequent nights? If you miss at night, you count during the day, regardless of whether it's the first day or the first night, right, or any subsequent night. So Rav Hai says, no matter what day we're talking about, if you miss at night, you can count during the day, which is clearly that's certainly how we hold today. Why don't we'll stop here within the Ron, and then we'll start to move on to see the Mishnah Torah. We'll see the Rambam. We'll see the Tur. And then we'll bring it down to Shulchan Aruch and the Mishnah Brura, and then we'll finish off with a Sefer Chinuch, which will sort of give us a little bit more interestingly of machshava that'll bring us into, that's how we'll finish today, and then I think we'll pick it up again next week. So the Rambam says a Mishnah Torah, and it's in Hilchos Tamidim Umusafim, so it's in the middle of Avoda. So he says, mitzvahs asay lispor sheva shabbasos tmimus miyam avas haomer shene'amar usfartem lachem imachras haShabbos. So the Rambam is really bringing it down to us, and we sort of started already with the Ran, but he's really bringing it all the way down to the Psukim, right? So the pasuk says that you have to count mimachras haShabbos, right? And the Gemara really spends a lot of time understanding what does machras haShabbos mean. Like, what is that? Are we really talking about a Sunday? Are we talking about the second day of Yontif, right? So the Gemara really works that out. And there's Shabbosos. It has to be seven Shabbosim or 7 weeks. Well, mitzvah limnos hayamim ima Shavuos. And the Rambam says we're counting both days and weeks. Shne'amar tisbru chamishim yom. And we learn that from the fact that you have to count out 50 days. And we start to count from the 16th of Nisan, the second day of Pesach. And then he says, Shachach v'lo mana b'layla mana b'yom, right? Just as what we saw with Rav Hai in the Ran. If you miss a night, you can still count by day. And you should count standing up. If you were sitting when you counted, that's okay too, at least b'diavad. Mitzvah zu al kol ish misrael b'chol makom uv'chol zman. And this is where it becomes sort of interesting with the Rambam. Like, what does he mean by this? That it's a mitzvah on every man from Yisrael, in every place and any time. And what we'll see is that it almost sounds from the Rambam that it's deraisa, not derabanan, because of v'chol makom or v'chol zaman. V'chol zaman makes it sound like it's the same chiyuv, regardless of what time period that you're sitting in, which makes it sound like it's still deraisa even today. But nashim avare peturim mimenu, because it's right. It's a mitzvah saseh zman grama. So then women are going to be patur. Avadim are also patur from this. V'tzarich levarich b'chol layla baruch Hashem Elokeinu melech haolam she'akir yishanu b'mtzvos tzivanu as sefiras haomer kodem sheyispar manu v'lo beirich yotzavinu chozeh mevarich. If you forgot to make the bracha, you're still yotza. You don't go back and then make the bracha afterwards. So that's the Rambam, and so the Rambam's not bringing anything. The biggest thing that the Rambam brings in that's a bit of a chiddush is that it sounds like he's implying that it is a mitzvah deraisa even today. Let's take a look at how the Tur brings it down. So the Tur says Arvis Achar Hatfila, and this is talking about tefillah of again, the second night of Pesach. Maschilin lispor haomer shezmano mitchilas leotes zayim b'nisan umonu v'holech memtes yom v'zmano sfira mitchilas halayla v'afilu eno layla mamish ela sevich hashecha yecholim lispor. So interesting thing that the Tur also brings down, and in the Tosfos, the Ran, we didn't see it exactly in the Ran, but the Ran also brought down this Tosfos that what if I count a little bit early? And this is where the Ran was talking about the idea that because it's derabanan and we want tmimus, then the earlier that I count might be better, because this way I get more tmimus, right? If I'm counting and it's still being a shmashos, I'm really getting in the full day of the counting, right? I'm really counting at the beginning of the day, whereas if I wait till nightfall, perhaps I've missed a piece of the day. So he says, even if it's not nightfall, right? It's a safek harshika, it's bein hashmashos, I can still count. No shachach lispor b'tchilas halayla holech l'sofer kol layla. But if I didn't count at the beginning, I can still count during the night. Mitzvah al kol echad ve'echad lispor la'atzmo v'tzurich lispor me'umad. And again, same idea that the Rambam says we don't count standing up. Right, levarech tichli v'sofer v'sofer yamim v'shvuos, and we also count days and weeks. Ketzad b'yom harishon omed mevorech. So you stand up and you make the bracha of Sefiras haomer. Hayom yom echad ad shemegia leshiva yamim. So we only count the days. Once we get to a week, then we say Azva Yomer Hayom Shiva Yamim Shehem Shavua Echad of Yom Shmona Yomar Hayom Shmona Yom Shehem Shavua Echad Yom Echad. So we see in the Ron, we see in the Torah, just like the Ron brought down that, that our minhag is to count not just each complete week, but once we hit a week, we start to count, and we mention the weeks every day, even though it's not a complete week. Okay, so that's the Torah. He keeps going further, but what I want to do is move to the Shulchan Aruch, because we'll see there's a bit of a difference in how the Shulchan Aruch paskins versus the Torah. So in the same simon, so the Shulchan Aruch brings down. He says, "Belel sheni achar tfilas arvis matchilin lispor haomer, v'imshachach lispor betchilas halayla holech v'sofer kol halayla." Very similar to the Torah. U'mitzvah kol echad lispor la'atzma v'tzorech lispor ma'umad u'levarech techila v'sofer hayamim v'ashvuos. Again, very similar to the Torah. Ketzad b'yom rishon omer hayom yom echad ad shmegia l'shiva yamim v'az yomer hayom shiva yamim shehem shavua echad v'yom shmini omer hayom shmona yamim shehem shavua echad v'yom echad v'omer la'omer v'chein ad sheyagia le'arba asar yom hayom arba asar yamim shehem shnei shavuos. So that's the first, and again, very similar to what the Torah said. But then he goes fighter and says, what happens if it's cloudy? Right, today we know exactly when it's nightfall, when it's not. But back in those days when they didn't have the calendars, the luach, and everything else that you could reference, so you'd reference by how dark it is. And what if it's a cloudy night? It becomes harder. So what happens if you make a mistake? It's cloudy. You think it's later than it really is. Uberchos Sefiras haomer, and you make the bracha, but it was too early, and you realize the clouds move over or something. You realize I did it too early. So therefore, you would go back and you would count again once it gets dark. And here's where we see the biggest break, right, between the Shulchan Aruch, the Beis Yosef, and the predecessor of the Torah, is that while the Torah said you should count earlier, you certainly could count earlier. The Shulchan Aruch, the Mechaber, says you really have to wait, or it's ra'ui to wait until Tzeis HaKochavim, until it's really dark out. He says the Hamedaktikim, right? Einam Sofrim. So therefore, let's take a look at what the Mishabura says on that. Hamedaktikim. So it says Rotza Lomar Demin Hadin Haya Efshar Lahakel Lispar Meshetechshach Af Kodem Tzitzol Kochavim. So he says, really, Minadin, you could count early, right? As we saw, the Tosfos and others have brought down, you can count early. Right, Ach Kodem Tzitzol Kochavim. The Bein Hashmashos who Safek Laila Azlinin Lakula Besafek Drabanan. Again, it's all Drabanan, so Safek Drabanan you can certainly count it earlier on in Bein Hashmashos. Sefiras Bizman Hazeh Shehu Midrabanan the Rova Poskim. Ella Demikom. So why should we wait until it says? So it says Ella Demikom Eno Nachon Lahachnis Atzmo Safek Lechatchila. And it sounds like what he's saying is because there are those, probably the Rambam, foremost, who say it's still Deraisa. Therefore, we shouldn't enter ourselves into, a sphere of being in Safek. And therefore, Lechatchila, we should really be waiting until nightfall in order to count. And he says, "V'chein roy la'asos." The Mishnah goes fighter. He says, "Rosulama lechatchila." Again, he's saying lechatchila certainly umikol makom b'di'evedim birech ben hashmashos yatsa. But clearly, if you do count earlier, you're yatsa. Ukanal aval Eliyah Rabbah. Now, this is what's interesting. Now, but he leaves it as quoting the Eliyah Rabbah, who says, "Mepakpek bezeh umitzadid enachon sheyachzor v'yispar b'tzisuk hachavim b'li baracha." And somehow this minhag that if you do count early, meaning early has to mean after it's already shkia, right? You can't count before Shkia. But if it's assuming it's already after Shkia, so now it's Bein Hashmashos, and you counted, the Eliyah Rabbah would say you should really count again after it gets dark. But he doesn't say this, but I think, oh no, he does. This is Billy Bracha, right? So even if you made the bracha earlier on, if you counted early, you'd still, according to the Eliyah Rabbah, you should still count later on once it gets dark. Okay, so that's where we see the real, I guess, the difference between Shulchan Aruch and Mishnah Berurah, how we paskin today, versus the Tur versus Tosfos, who said that you could actually count early. Okay. So let's take a look at the Sefer HaChinuch, and we'll finish with this. So the Sefer HaChinuch in Mitzvah Shin Vav says, Mitzvah Sefiras haomer. L'saper Tisha v'arba'im yom yom habas haomer shehu yom shisha asar b'nisan shneimar svartem lechem imarchas haShabbos miyom aviachem es omer hatnufa b'minyan zechova, and it's to count. Counting is a chiyuv. V'aleinu limnos bo hayamim yom yom. V'chein hashvua, so we count both days and weeks. Shekasav Amar Tisaprim Chamishim Yom. V'Amar Gam Kein Shiva Shavuos Tisapir Lecha. Perish Amar Abai Be'Gemara Benachos Mitzvah Lemamne Yomi Mitzvah Lemamne Shavui. Right, we saw this early in the Ran, being that they quoted this, that we count both days and weeks. V'yesh minam aforshim shahayadaitem ki kavanasa kasav limos hashvuos davke keshen shlamim. And again, this idea that you're really only counting the weeks when they are complete. But you don't have to, right? The way we count, we don't have to do it. The days are the ikar. We don't have to count every day what week we're on. And the Rosh in his Tshuvas ki haderech hanivchar lahazker minin hashvus im hayamim tamid, and this perhaps is the source for why we count the way we do. Is this Rosh in his Tshuvas that it's best, right? The best way to do this is to count days and weeks, even when it's not a complete week. V'yarei shamayim yivchar darkam lahotzi min asaf mikol safek v'lo yachush l'tiferes hamilos v'chein nagu hayam b'chol makomos she'shemanu. Okay, so that's the chinuch. Now, where it's interesting is just jumping down. He says misharshem mitzvah, and he does this with every mitzvah. Right? He talks about what is the root, what's the reason for every mitzvah. And he gives something, and again, he's he wrote this to his son, so it's really sort of his way of being mechanech. His son maybe had more children. I don't know for sure, but this is where he gets a little bit interesting. He says outside of pshat, levisha kol ikran she Yisrael. Eno ela Torah. What is the ikar of Yisrael? Torah, right? That's everything for us. Torah nivru shemayim v'aretz. Because of the Torah, that's why, right? The Medrash says that Hashem, it's only because of Reshis, and Reshis is Torah, that Hashem created shemayim v'aretz. U'kamar she'kasav im lo brisa yomam v'layla v'gomer ha'ikar v'yasiba shenigul v'yatzu mitzrayim. And that's the only reason why we were, or that is the reason why we were redeemed from Mitzrayim, kadei she'kablu haTorah b'Sinai v'kamuha, in order that we could be makabel the Torah at Sinai, and that we can be makayim the Torah. K'moshe Amar Hashem l'Moshe, b'zeh lecha ha'os ki anochi shlachticha b'hotziacha es ha'am Mitzrayim ta'avodun as Elokim al ha'har hazeh. That I sent to bring you out of Mitzrayim in order that you can serve me or serve God on this mountain, on Har Sinai. No perish a pasuk hotziacha osam mitzrayim yelecha os shetavdun es Elokim al ha'har hazeh klomar shetekablu haTorah shehi ha'ikar hagadol shebishvil zeh heim nigalim v'hi tachlis hatova shalhem. And this Torah that we received, that is the purpose of all the good that we have in our lives. And this is much more important than just the idea of going from cherus, or going min hacherus me avdus. It's interesting language, but I'm guessing that what he means is going from avdus into cherus. L'chein yaseh Hashem l'Moshe os b'tzeisa mi'avdus leKabbalas haTorah, and this is the sign that in taking us out from avdus of Mitzrayim to Kabbalas haTorah, ki atafel osin oso os leolam el ha'ikar. right? That he's bringing us to the ikr of what we're doing. And this seems to be, in line with that medrash that the Ran brought in, that we saw at the beginning, this medrash that Bnei Yisrael were counting up to being able to receive the Torah at Sinai. That seems to be what the chinuch is, at least in line with what the chinuch is saying here, is that the idea of Sefiras haomer is this counting towards the receiving of Torah. We'll stop here, but this is where I want to sort of go, and then we'll see if maybe next week we'll try to get into some of the more machshav. How do we understand Sefiras haomer? Right, there's these ideas of the that each day has its own attribute to it, right? Are we in Hod of Gvura today? I think, if I remember right. So what does that mean exactly, right? Gvura meaning constriction, and Hod is splendor. So what does that mean, and what are we trying to accomplish as we go, each day through Sefiras haomer? I heard somebody was saying that I hear it probably every year, right? It's not that we're counting every day, it's that we're making every day count, right? That there's this idea of Sefiras haomer that we're supposed to be more focused on these days, that each individual day is something that we can sort of make into something bigger than it is. So hopefully, next week we'll go further into that. But at least for now, we see, where some of the halachos of counting come from, and how they're brought down from the sources in the Gemara all the way down to Shulchan Aruch and into the Mishnah Berurah.